Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is on, well, one of the most defining military concepts of the Second World War, Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This was the core tactic we associate with Germany's really stunning, almost unbelievable early victories, particularly those swift campaigns through Poland in 1939, and then, of course, France and the Low Countries in 1940.
And the central question we really have to grapple with, which I think challenges the standard narrative, is this. Was that early German military success truly the result of implementing a coherent, revolutionary doctrine we call Blitzkrieg? Or was it perhaps the outcome of a superior execution of existing ideas about maneuver warfare, amplified by surprise, improvisation, and some really crucial mistakes made by the Allies?
I hold the position that Blitzkrieg was far more than just good tactics. It was a systematically developed military doctrine, primarily championed by the visionary Heinz Guderian, that uniquely integrated modern technology, armor, air power, and wireless communications to achieve a kind of decisive, deep penetration that fundamentally changed the operational level of war.
And I'll be arguing that the term Blitzkrieg is largely a post hoc description, something popularized by propaganda and the press. The German success, while terrifyingly effective, was really an incarnation of Blitzkrieg, the traditional German war of movement, which, shared deep philosophical roots with parallel doctrines being developed in Russia and Britain. Their true advantage, I think, lay not in a unique philosophy, but in organizational culture and sheer battlefield audacity.
The genesis of this revolution, it seems to me, lies in the trenches of World War I. German military thinkers recognized that future wars had to be swift and decisive to avoid the disastrous attrition and blockade of 1914-1918. So this determination led men like Guderian, who was a highly perceptive officer, to synthesize the necessary elements. He formalized this vision in his 1937 work, Achtung Panzer, where he insisted that tanks must be concentrated into cohesive, independent armored divisions, rather than being dispersed to support infantry, which was really the prevailing wisdom around the world. The Panzer Division was deliberately engineered as a self-contained, mobile fighting force, a sort of small army designed for independent operations deep behind enemy lines. It wasn't just tanks. It included motorized infantry, anti-tank battalions, engineers, and critically, its own rapid supply system. But the true innovation was the integration of command and air support.
Guderian utilized radio communication extensively, keeping his commanders near the front, and, crucially, he established these seamless links with the Luftwaffe. Dive bombers, the Ju-87 Stuka, were essentially converted into mobile airborne artillery capable of immediate, precise strikes. The whole goal was rapid, brutal penetration, bypassing strong points to achieve the systemic disorganization and collapse of the enemy command structure. France's six-week conquest in 1940, Case Yellow, was really the ultimate test of this fully integrated system.
I come at it from a different way, which focuses on the terminology itself. The term Blitzkrieg is highly misleading. It was a phrase coined by the British press after the Poland campaign, describing the perceived speed of the whole thing. It was never a formal doctrine in German military service. In fact, it appears only twice in German military literature before 1939. High-ranking German leaders themselves later called it, an idiotic word. The German military just viewed their successes as the superior application of Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, a concept they had always championed. And moreover, let's be honest about the technology here. German success was often achieved despite their material, not because of some overwhelming superiority. The early tanks, the Panzer I and II, were little more than armored machine gun carriers, suitable for reconnaissance perhaps, but not for a breakthrough. Even their main battle tank, the Panzer III, was equipped with a 37mm gun that was objectively ineffective against Allied heavy armor, like the French Char B1 or the British Matilda. The shell would often just bounce clean off. So the victory was psychological and tactical. It relied on exploiting speed and surprise, a key tenet of maneuver warfare everywhere, not the product of a unique, systematically superior doctrine. Case Yellow, in particular, was built on the audacity of commanders taking unauthorized initiative, and frankly, the incredible good fortune that the Allies made one of the greatest strategic errors in military history by neglecting the Ardennes. I think we have to confront the reality that the philosophical roots of what we call Blitzkrieg, surprise, concentration, mobility, air support, effective communication, were shared globally and arguably even more developed theoretically elsewhere. I mean, consider the Soviet deep battle doctrine. This doctrine, developed in parallel in the 1920s and 30s, focused on the sequential and deep penetration of enemy defenses by echelon forces. In fact, German officers secretly trained in Russia during the 1920s exchanging ideas. The difference wasn't a unique German idea, but rather the unique German culture of command. The traditions fostered by thinkers like von Seeckt, emphasizing independence of action or off-tracks tactic, and decentralized decision-making that gave their officers the freedom to adapt and exploit opportunities in real time. That, coupled with the Allies being surprised by the direction of the attack, is what caused the collapse, not some formalized doctrine that was uniquely superior to the Soviet or even the British theoretical models. The Allies shouldn't have been surprised. Their own thinkers like de Gaulle and Littlehart have been arguing for similar mobile armored concepts for years.
Okay, I see why you emphasize the shared intellectual inheritance, particularly with deep battle, but I would frame the difference not merely as superior execution, but as a revolutionary organizational synthesis. Deep battle often envisioned operations in great depth, using successive echelons to defeat forces over time. Guderian's vision, however, was fundamentally about speed of command to induce immediate paralysis. This speed of command became a weapon itself. By having armored commanders operating right at the spearhead, equipped with wireless communication, they could bypass the traditional slow, centralized command structure that plagued the Allies. When the tanks broke through, the commanders could immediately communicate with their forward air liaison officer, calling in the Stukas for these precise, pinpoint attacks. This coordination was, as the source material notes, excellent.
Delivered such a rapid, devastating punch that it just short-circuited the Allied decision cycle. The operational tempo they created was so fast that the French and British never had time to call headquarters, confirm the threat, and organize a coherent counterattack before the German spearheads were already 50 miles further down the road. That combination, concentrated armor plus seamless tactical air support and rapid command, was unique and, I think, warrants the title of revolutionary doctrine.
But doesn't that fundamentally undermine the idea of a structured doctrine if you admit the success relied entirely on the psychological effect of shock and the ability of individual commanders to break protocol? If the doctrine was so sound, why was the material so poor? You had commanders relying on audacity to succeed where their armor objectively failed. This suggests the Wehrmacht was compensating for a lack of resources and production speed with sheer tactical brilliance and aggression, rather than executing some fully developed, integrated, and funded revolutionary plan.
Well, the technological limitations force the emphasis onto method over material, which is precisely the genius of the doctrine. It proved that concentration and speed could defeat individually superior enemy vehicles and larger armies. If we look at Poland, it serves as the vital test tube where these elements were falling into place. While yes, largely conventional forces were used for the vast encirclement, the German air-ground component was critical. The initial task of the Luftwaffe was swift, destroy the Polish Air Force, which was virtually annihilated by day 3, and then shift entirely to acting as airborne artillery for the ground forces, specifically interfering with Polish mobilization and communications. Guderian's panzer divisions, despite facing some resistance, demonstrated their core ability to move, penetrate, and disrupt, losing only a minimal number of personnel.
This success was intensively studied and formed the blueprint for the perfected strategy used in France. Poland proved the destructive synergy of the Stuka and the Panzer.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the logistical reality that dictated the overall pace in Poland? While the Panzer divisions certainly moved quickly, the overall campaign was ultimately a victory of the classic German tradition of encirclement and envelopment, the Kesselschlacht, carried out mainly by conventional infantry forces. The greater part of the German army in 1939, as much as 75%, was still reliant on marching infantry and, crucially, was overwhelmingly reliant on horsepower for its logistics. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of horses transporting supplies, artillery, and ammunition. That significantly diminished the actual pace of the general advance eastward. It tied the motorized elements to the speed of the supply lines, which were moving at the pace of a horse-drawn cart. This fundamentally contradicts the idea of a comprehensive lightning war doctrine fully executed in 1939. The victory was comprehensive, but the method was a blend of old and new, and predominantly old, which relied on the Poles being trapped between two invasion fronts, German and Soviet.
I agree that the German army was not fully notarized and that logistics were handled conventionally in the rear echelons. But that only highlights the strategic decision underlying the doctrine. Concentrate all available speed into the armored spearhead, allowing it to penetrate and disorganize the enemy so quickly that the follow-on infantry and supply chains could catch up later, encountering minimal resistance. The goal of the doctrine was not universal mechanization, but surgical, decisive, deep penetration. The philosophy of the doctrine demanded speed, and that rapid advance was its own defense. It exploited the principle of command paralysis. When successful, as demonstrated by the commanders covering 50 miles a day in France, the speed validated the core idea that the method was more important than having a technically superior tank in every panzer division. The fact that they successfully penetrated the Allied line, forced the collapse, and achieved their goals before the logistical fragility could be exposed, confirms the initial revolutionary potential of the concentrated, coordinated method.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the methodology was robust enough to be called revolutionary. Where I diverge is in the universality of its application. The core problem with calling Blitzkrieg a doctrine is that it proved inherently fragile and non-universal when tested against geographical and logistical depth. Logistics wasn't just a side concern. It was the key problem that defined its limits. The success in France was conditional. It was a short campaign against an opponent with poor coordination and limited geographical depth to retreat into. If Guderian's spearheads had been held for even a couple of weeks after the initial breakthrough, which they easily could have been if the French had executed coordinated counterattacks, those units would have run out of fuel, ammunition, and food. The entire thrust would have stalled, and the doctrine would have been instantly exposed as a high-risk gamble, not a reliable system.
But that is the nature of maneuver warfare. I mean, every doctrine requires risk and favorable execution. The fact that Guderian's gamble worked is what validates the theoretical concept of using speed to bypass logistics, forcing the enemy to break before your own supply lines stretch too far.
Using a successful gamble with a universal revolutionary doctrine, we have to look at the comprehensive test, the Eastern Front. When the Blitzkrieg technique was tested on a truly vast scale against an enemy with strategic depth and harsh terrain, Russia, a campaign intended to last a few months but stretching to 1,000 days, the system completely failed. Why? Precisely due to those logistical issues. Overextended supply lines collapsed under the sheer distance. The lack of infrastructure, dirt roads turning to mud, the Rasputsa, meant the rapid wheeled mobility essential to the doctrine just vanished. The doctrine required constant forward motion, but when the supply chain was moving at the pace of a mule, the armored thrust became static, vulnerable, and ultimately surrounded. That proves that Blitzkrieg was a conditional, specialized technique dependent on short distances, good weather, and a strategically inept enemy, rather than a permanently applicable revolutionary war doctrine.
I think that's an overly harsh retrospective judgment. The failure in Russia speaks more to overreach and the sheer, unforeseen scale of the Soviet resistance and geography, not the lack of validity of the doctrine itself. In its intended operational sphere, to break the deadlock of static warfare and quickly defeat a geographically limited enemy, it worked perfectly. It achieved in weeks what the old style of war failed to achieve in years. The scale of the success in 1940 is the empirical proof of a radical innovation in an execution, regardless of what the propaganda machine labeled it.
But the historical record shows that when the execution relied solely on doctrine against an enemy that learned and adapted, which the Soviets did very quickly, developing counter methods like deep defense, the logistical frailty proved fatal. The concept was powerful, yes, but its success was contingent on the operational shock being overwhelming and immediate. Once that shock wore off, the underlying structural limitations The shortage of fuel, the inadequate road network, the small number of fully motorized divisions were exposed. It was a spectacular tactic, but a brittle doctrine.
We return, then, to the fundamental claim. The early German victories were a direct result of meticulously planned operational methods, Guderian's coordinated vision of high-speed, deep penetration that successfully integrated air power, armor, and communication technology into a devastatingly effective system. The sheer magnitude of the strategic gains made in 1940 confirms its status as a radical innovation in the execution of war, fundamentally changing the expectations of conflict speed and intensity.
While undeniably effective in the short term and certainly terrifying to its victims, I maintain that the unique concept of Blitzkrieg is largely mythological in a doctrinal sense. German success stemmed primarily from superior training, the initiative of daring young commanders, and, critically, the successful execution of general maneuver warfare concepts that other nations also possessed but failed to apply effectively. Its ultimate failure in Russia highlights its dependency on favorable circumstances and its inherent structural fragility.
The source material clearly illustrates that understanding the German success requires acknowledging the crucial interplay of brilliant tactical execution, the psychological shock it induced on unprepared opponents, and the necessity of highly trained, independent commanders alongside the known limitations of the underlying logistical philosophy.
And that complex interplay of superior training, bold initiative, and the circumstances under which movement warfare is applied continues to shape military thinking today, proving that even the most successful early military philosophy can be quickly neutralized when divorced from realistic logistical capacity. It remains a fascinating study in the limits of military power.